Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on mastering the clinical research publication journey, from submitting to publishing your research. To get us started today, I'd like to introduce you to our team. First, Alex Morrison is a publishing editor on the STM Journal's editorial team, managing a range of scientific and medical journals. Alex has a background in content management, magazine publishing, and literary publishing, and holds a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from the University of Denver and a Master of Fine Arts and Creative Writing from the University of New Orleans. Next, Joe Tumalo is an associate publishing editor on Sage's U.S. Science, Tech, and Medicine Science, Tech, and Medicine Journal's editorial team. He joined Sage last year with experience from the Getty Research Institute Publications Program and gained over 3 years of experience with academic journals while pursuing his PhD in Italian at UCLA. Next, Dr. Arnija is a plastic surgeon at British Columbia's Children's Hospital and Vancouver Coastal Health. He has published extensively and received many grants and awards as professor in the Division of Plastic Surgery at UBC and associate member of the Saunders School of Business at UBC. Currently, he is a Canadian Medical Protective Association counselor and is the editor-in-chief of Plastic Surgery, the official journal of the Canadian Society of Plastic Surgeons. Next, Dr. Duncan is a tenured professor in the Department of Psychology at Oklahoma State University. She is a pediatric psychologist with research expertise in the areas of adherence, self-management, transition from pediatric to adult healthcare, pulmonary disorders, and brain injuries. She has served as secretary for the Society of Pediatric Psychology, has served on editorial boards for multiple journals, and currently is the editor for Clinical Practice in Pediatric Psychology, one of the two flagship journals for the Society of Pediatric Psychology. And last, my name is Sean Scarsbrick. I'm a senior marketing manager on the author marketing team, and my primary role is to support authors and reviewers as they move through the publishing process. Before we get started into the bulk of today's presentation, I'd like to highlight our panelists' work. If you are a potential reviewer or author, please do consider these journals as places to get started, and we will send over links to this with you all after the call. Sage is proud to publish a diverse and high-quality portfolio of clinical journals spanning key disciplines such as oncology, surgery, clinical biochemistry, pharmacology, and psychology. We're proud to partner with prestigious societies worldwide and are home to the fastest-growing medical and health science program of the past 20 years. Throughout today's webinar, please do send us your questions. We will address them live at the end of the call today, and any that we cannot talk about or we don't have time to, we will follow up in a blog post after the call. And with that, I'm happy to pass this over to Alex to get us started.
Thank you, Sean. The National Institute of Health defines clinical research as medical research that involves people to test new treatments and therapies. Clinical research plays a vital role in advancing healthcare, deepening our understanding of health and disease, informing clinical guidelines and best practices, and driving the development of new drugs, therapies, and medical technologies. Ultimately, clinical research enhances patient care and improves outcomes. The clinical research landscape is evolving. With patient centricity, there's a growing emphasis on patient experience, convenience, and engagement. Trials are increasingly designed around the needs and lifestyles of participants. Advancements in artificial intelligence and machine learning are accelerating drug discovery, optimizing trial design, and enabling predictive analytics to forecast patient outcomes and improve efficiency. Ensuring representation across age, gender, ethnicity, and geography is critical. Diverse trials improve health equity and make findings more generalizable. Data from electronic health records, registries, and wearables is being used to support regulatory decisions and post-market surveillance. Adaptive and decentralized trials are becoming more common, offering flexible, cost-effective, and accessible alternatives to traditional models. There's a rapid growth in areas like cell and gene therapies, driving more targeted and individualized treatment approaches. Mobile apps, wearables, and telemedicine are now standard tools in trials, supporting real-time data collection and improving patient adherence. These are just a few of the many trends shaping the future of clinical research. We asked one of Sage's editors to write up a wish list of what they'd like to see in research in their field and in articles submitted to their journal. This is what they came up with. There should be a clear rationale for the study, with a well-defined hypothesis and aim. The paper should set the scene by exploring existing literature and identifying the gap this research is addressing. Research doesn't exist in a vacuum. It should engage meaningfully with what's already been done and show how it contributes to the broader field. The methodology must be appropriate for the study design with robust statistical analysis to support the findings. Results should be presented clearly using graphs and figures to aid understanding. And it's important to remember that null or unexpected results are still valuable. They're a crucial part of the scientific process. A strong discussion section will critically appraise the findings, compare them to existing literature, highlight what's novel, and acknowledge both strengths and limitations. Finally, writing and formatting really do matter. Journals receive a high volume of submissions, and many are let down by poor structure, language issues, or formatting errors. I'll pass it on to Joe.
Thank you, Alex. I'll take a few minutes now to talk about some steps that you all can take prior to submission and even prior to writing to ensure that your paper will stand out. First, it's important to note that there are 13,000 to 14,000 research articles published every day. Selecting the right journal and preparing your manuscript appropriately will help you to stand out from the noise. First, be sure to check the aims and scope of the journal very carefully, as failure to account for this is the #1 reason for rejection. Your specific research area may not be a good fit, or if the journal may not consider your type of methodology. Is it asking for specific discipline and methodology? Does it have an interdisciplinary focus? Does the journal only cover a niche subject matter? I recommend looking at a free sample if it's a SAGE journal to get a better understanding of what studies make it to publication and to find out what sort of content is published in a typical issue. Does your research fit well alongside this? When you actually sit down to write, remember that a good title and abstract can improve the likelihood of your article being discovered and read. Also worth noting is that the title and abstract is what is sent out to potential reviewers. If the title and abstract are easy to read and clearly outline what the manuscript is about, reviewers will be more likely to agree to review your article and reduce the time your paper sits in peer review. You will notice that we included on this slide authorship, and I would like to take a moment to delve more deeply into this now. SAGE has adopted the International Council of Medical Journal Editors authorship recommendations, and credit, or the credit contributor roles taxonomy, is an initiative introduced in 2013 where a deeper level of detail is recorded to capture the nature of individual contributions, for example, software, investigation, writing, review, and editing. These can help you to determine who should be listed on your article as an author. So what makes someone an author? Well, anyone who made a substantial contribution to the concept or design of the work, or in the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data. Anyone who drafted the article or revised it critically for important intellectual content. Anyone who approved the version to be published, and any individual who participated sufficiently in the work to take public responsibility for appropriate portions of the content. Any individual who fits these categories should be credited as an author. All others should be listed in the acknowledgement section. Delving more deeply into the writing of your article, when presenting quantitative data, it's best to start with demographic information to provide context. It's also helpful to briefly restate the hypothesis and highlight any key trends in the data. For qualitative data, the presentation often blends with the discussion. This type of data should be well structured, using clear headings and subheadings to guide the reader through the findings. When sharing experimental data, it's important to separate the results from the discussion. Use figures and tables to present the data clearly and describe any differences or relationships observed. Explanations and interpretations should be reserved for the discussion section. Tables and graphs are powerful tools for visualizing data. They should be clear, concise, and ideally self-explanatory, helping the audience to quickly grasp the key messages. When preparing a manuscript, it's essential to check the submission guidelines of the journal that you're targeting, and each journal may have specific requirements that should be included in the section of the paper. And if you're working on a clinical trial, remember that clinical trials are a major component for research, and as you're working on one, there are some key essentials that you should keep in mind. First, the trial should be registered in a WHO-approved public trials registry. Many journals require registration at or before the time of the first participant's enrollment, so it's important to check this early in the process. When submitting your manuscript, be sure to include the trial name, registration number, and URL. Clinical trials should also follow the consort reporting guidelines to ensure transparency and completeness in reporting. Now, when it actually comes time to write, there's a few key steps that you can follow to help your manuscript stand out from the rest. First, keep the language as clear and simple as possible. Use the first-person active voice. Read articles from your target journal to understand expectations for language and terminology. Use a translation or professional editing service. Ask the journal if they'll publish in your preferred language either the full article or just the abstract. And do not use AI tools unless this is specifically allowed. So with that, I will turn it back over to Alex, who will talk to us about the submissions process.
Point, by following the steps and recommendations outlined by Joe, you've written the perfect article. Congratulations. However, there are important decisions now to make and procedures to follow. As we mentioned earlier, there are over 13,000 articles published each day. Choosing the right journal is crucial to improving the chances of your article being accepted and your research having impact. Which community are you hoping to reach with your article? Your supervisor or peers may offer guidance on any restrictions or requirements, or may recommend journals that have offered a positive experience in the past. For authors, journal homepages can be a rich source of information and a glimpse into what the review and publication process might be like. This includes the aims and scope and key metrics, which include citation impact, review and publication times, anonymization of peer review information, and often the article rejection rate for the journal. You may also want to check if your institution has an open access agreement with the journal's publisher. Publishers usually have a page on open access agreements where you can check to see if your article will be made OA for free or at a discount. You can also use dedicated tools to identify the right journal based on your proposed title and abstract. For instance, Sage offers our journal recommender. Once you decide which journal you'd like to submit to, spend some time reading the manuscript submission guidelines for that particular journal. Editors really appreciate the effort you put in here. If you do not follow the guidelines, there is a large chance your paper might be unsubmitted and sent back for adjustments before even being considered. Consider looking at articles from the journal as a reference for formatting, structure, and writing style. Make sure to include funding, conflict of interest, and ethics statements, even if you have nothing to declare. You may also want to consider creating a visual or graphical abstract to help with promotion and understanding by the public. When in doubt, reach out to the journal editorial office for advice if your manuscript might be a good fit. A very important note, be sure to submit to only one journal at a time. Send in your manuscript via the journal's preferred submission system, usually an online manuscript submission system like Scholar One. Follow the steps outlined in the platform and make sure to read all declarations and statements carefully next to checkboxes. The boxes you tick may have important ethical ramifications or may involve agreeing to paying additional charges for open access publication or charges for additional pages, for instance. After your successful submission, your paper will move into the peer review process. I'd like to spend a moment sharing with you what the overall peer review process looks like and highlight the core role of peer reviewers. After a paper is submitted, it is checked for compliance with journal guidelines for things such as correct formatting and for the fit within the journal's aims and scope. If it passes these checks, it is sent to peer reviewers. In most cases, peer reviewers are matched to a paper based on keywords provided in the paper to keywords provided by the reviewer if they've created a reviewer account, or to keywords in articles the reviewer has authored. Reviewers are invited to review, and once they accept the invitation, they will have access to the paper in their reviewer center in our peer review system. Once reviewers have assessed the paper and prepared comments for the editor and authors, they then make a recommendation of revision, reject, or accept to the editor in the system. The editor can then make a final decision based on the recommendations from reviewers. Going through peer review, it is important to accept feedback and remember that critiques are not personal, but are meant to make your research better. Remember that very few articles are accepted unconditionally, and it is likely the reviewer and or the editor will have some recommendations for you. Peer review is an important part of the research ecosystem. Reading and reviewing can help you improve as an author too. There are two major ways a reviewer can start the journey of becoming a volunteer reviewer. The first is to create an account in the journal's peer review site. Use strong keywords to illustrate your research expertise. Good keywords are descriptive, but not too descriptive. The second way to become a volunteer reviewer is by connecting with editors. A reviewer may consider reaching out to editors directly via email or by creating a Web of Science account. A number of our clinical medicine journals are currently recruiting for their editorial review boards. ERB members are responsible for reviewing 4 articles for the journal per year, including any revised versions of those assigned manuscripts. ERB members are also encouraged to contribute to the journal's editorial direction by contributing their knowledge and insights on current and emerging areas of research. You'll earn recognition and APC discounts for OA journals for successful peer review, as well as gaining invaluable academic experience and progression opportunities for other editorial roles in the future. If you would like to join one, please complete the online application form, which can be found by following the link provided on this slide. And your application will be assessed fully by the journal's editors. Once an article is accepted to a journal, it moves to the production phase. This will involve copy editing and typesetting, as well as an opportunity for the authors and editors to review proofs of the final article before publication. Articles rarely go straight into an issue and are instead published online first, which allows them to be included in most indexes and allows them to be citable before being placed in an issue later. After publication, it's important to promote your work so that it reaches as many people as possible. Utilizing search engine optimization strategies and connecting the article to your ORCID ID are important things to consider early on. After publication, be sure that your work email pardon me, be sure to share your work on social media and with your colleagues, being sure to make the most of conferences as well. You may want to consider drafting a brief blog post that describes your work or putting together a visual abstract that is easier to share. Here's an example of a special collection series that may be of interest. This is happening across 12 journals in our Gold Open Access portfolio regarding GLP-1 receptor agonists. The series aims to consolidate and disseminate the latest research findings on GLP-1 receptor agonists, highlighting their established roles in managing type 2 diabetes mellitus and obesity, as well as their emerging therapeutic potential in various other medical fields. And there's a link for more information and how you should submit at the bottom of the slide.
Thank you very much, Alex and Joe. We're going to move quickly into some tips and tricks from our guest panelists, but before we do that, I wanted to flag some upcoming things from Sage. I hope you're enjoying today's webinar, and just note that we do have some others that are in the pipeline. So in a few weeks, we have one about how to leverage your institutional library resources to support your publication journey. In October, we will be talking more about oncology research and a few other things for the rest of the year. At Sage, we have a dedicated space to support authors. We have our Information for Authors hub, which includes information on how to get published, answers quick questions for you about all of the steps for the publication process. We also have an author newsletter, and this is a newer thing to promote our upcoming resources and our upcoming webinars. And links to this will be sent to you after the call. Are you interested in joining the Sage community? We've got a few different links here for you as well on how to submit your own work, how to read our content, and then potentially how to join an editorial board. Again, all of this will be sent over to you after the call today. And with that, I want to pass this over to our guest panelist, to Dr. Jugpal Arnija, to talk about some tips and tricks from his perspective.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks, Alex and Joe, for the presentation at the front end. You've really been comprehensive, so what I'll add is just a little bit of color commentary, and of course, at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions. I've been an editor for coming up to 5 years now, and we've had a partnership with Sage, I think almost up to 10 years now, and it's really been a great collaboration with the team at Sage. As it relates to authors submitting their research, I'm going to speak from the lens of clinical medicine, so mostly clinical plastic surgery. And as it relates to our specialty, we're a small specialty. We don't lend ourselves to randomized controlled trials. We have small cohorts of patients, and so that's the sort of type of studies that generally are submitted to our journal, our cohort studies or retrospective reviews. Some multi-centered prospective trials as well, but very few randomized trials. So, ultimately, what are we looking for as a plastic surgery journal? And I think one of the earlier slides that I think Alex talked about really covered it from the doctor from Ulster. You really want to find a gap in the literature, something novel. Certainly confirmatory research is very important, but finding something novel is always going to attract the attention of the editorial team. And then a couple things that really I think are important as it relates to designing your study. You really want to make sure that you design the right study and then you have the right methodology. How are you going to sort of design the study to answer your question? And specific to that is what type of outcome measures. In the old days, it was surgeon-reported outcome measures, and now we've pivoted to a few new ways of reporting outcomes, and that is, system-reported outcomes, if anyone's familiar with the National Surgical Quality Improvement Program, and there's other big data sets out there that really lend themselves to the system looking at the outcomes from the system perspective. And important things that way are related to cost and overall sort of quality of care. But of course, the other new vanguard is patient-reported outcomes. And as a doctor who treats patients or surgeon who treats patients, I mean, really the most important person in the room ultimately is the patient. We have learners and we have personal satisfaction as a surgeon, but the most important person in the room is always the patient. So we've really advanced our outcome measure strategy by doing PROM research. As been mentioned, follow the guidelines in the journal, and they're on the website. We wrote a little piece on guidelines for authors and reviewers, and that's something that maybe if you're interested, you can review. I think Sean put the link up on the slides earlier. As it relates to designing your study, checklists are important. And if you look at the Equator Network, there's a whole pile of different checklists that are out there, depending on what type of study you're planning on designing. There's been much review lately of, much interest in systematic reviews where we pool a bunch of studies together. And of course, that checklist is the PRISMA checklist, just as an example. And then just a few final closing statements. As you begin your research journey or try to improve it, The Sage platform is fantastic. There's so many resources like we have today at this webinar is just another example, but if you trove through the website, you'll find great resources available to you. So I'd encourage you to do that. Writing is iterative. I still don't think I'm a good writer, and I've been doing this for, gosh, 20 plus years. You can always improve your writing. You can always be more concise. You can always, deliver the message in a more eloquent way. So keep that in mind. And I'll just share a short story. I was doing research with one of the Harvard plastic surgeons many years ago, and this was early in my career, and we were on revision maybe 10 or 12, and I said to him, maybe it's, we're kind of correcting our corrections now. And he had a great teaching point for me. He says, I have 500 plus publications and I'm still not a good writer. And so I always remember that and share that with my trainees and those who are doing research with me, to share that, here you have a 65, 70-year-old plastic surgeon who still doesn't think he's a good writer. And so I agree with that comment that writing can always improve. And then the final thing is research is actually a long process. From an idea that's generated, we did a study a few years ago on this, and the data wasn't very robust because it's lots of recall bias. But all that to say is that when we did the math from idea generation to ultimately getting published in a journal, it's somewhere between 3 to 4 years. And so, you have to be patient. It's not like your article is going to be published, in 12 months. That would be almost unheard of in my experience. And there's different steps along the research cycle, and after your research is sort of completed, presenting your research, then obviously submitting your research to a journal. Don't be discouraged by the fact that, some of the reviewers can be a bit critical. As described earlier in this webinar, that's for your benefit, and that's to make the quality of the article ultimately published better. So, sometime I remember the first time I received feedback on the first article I submitted, I was almost shaken by the comments that came back. But at the end of the day, it's not a personal attack. It's really just to improve the research. And I'll end there and I'll pass it back to Sean. But thank you very much for your attendance today and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. And yeah, as you're speaking, you see lots of good questions coming through in the Q&A, so we'll definitely address some of those later on. But before we do that, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Duncan for her thoughts.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today at the webinar. And I think we have a little bit of some resonation here and similar messages spoken across the panelists, but thought I would share some tips specific to our journal and then perhaps some that are a little bit more general. Is someone going to advance slides for me, hopefully? Gotcha. So I think, what makes a competitive manuscript for our journal, for CPPP as we call it for short? It's a journal that is really targeting the clinical practice and the science behind that of pediatric psychology, as well as some other professional issues and training issues in our field. So really, fit is key. So we're looking for articles that are involving research that takes place in pediatric healthcare settings, or that incorporates pediatric psychologists or specifically addresses their practice and their professional issues, because that really is the readership of our journal. So I think that goes back to align with some of the earlier points about really understanding what's the journal's mission, what's their readership, and then taking the time to look at the kinds of articles that are in there, because that's going to help you know that your manuscript might be competitive for that particular journal. We also like to see manuscripts that align with the types of manuscripts published in our journal. We've mentioned some of these already. So you've heard, for example, people talking about systematic reviews and meta-analyses. We also, in our journal, take case studies or case reports. We also do brief reports, as well as intervention research, observational studies, qualitative and mixed methods research, quality improvement studies, because that's really relevant to the field of clinical practice, and also targeted topical reviews, which might be a little more specific than a broader systematic review. We're looking for articles that really have a strong rationale for the research as well as a robust empirical approach. So looking for things like having adequate sample size to power analyses, using good solid methods like well-validated measures, reducing bias, perhaps checking on reliability if there's sort of a subjective coding approach, things like that. And then using appropriate statistical analyses to address the study aims and hypotheses, and then appropriately interpreting those study findings. So discussions don't just repeat what or summarize what the research results are, but instead kind of pull them together to tell a story. But it's also important to recognize, as was talked about earlier, the limitations of a particular study and really being a little bit cautious and not overstepping some of the interpretation that can be made by that particular study's findings. Next slide. So how can your manuscript be strengthened? It's already been mentioned here, so I feel like my thunder got stolen just a little bit, but there is this amazing set of checklists that I know when I first was doing research, these were not available. So instead, you'd submit articles and find out what you were missing. Well, these checklists are wonderful tools to use to make sure that your manuscripts are complete. It helps with the transparency and the reproducibility of your study. But it's also just a fantastic checklist, like, oops, I forgot that, because sometimes we miss the forest for the trees. And so we end up getting so in depth with our own particular study that we miss something big that really should be obvious and isn't, because we're kind of in the thick of it. So these checklists are wonderful. And as was mentioned earlier, there's a range of them depending on what your study, what kind of methodological approach your study takes. So for example, there's strobe checklists for a variety of different kinds of observational studies. There's PRISMA guidelines for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. As was talked about earlier by Alex and Joe, the consort checklist is useful and relevant to clinical trials. And there's also checklists out there for qualitative research like Correct. So there's a number of them on the Equator website. And I very much encourage beginning level researchers, my graduate students, to access these checklists and use them, because it just strengthens the quality and content of manuscripts. I think another really important step, and it aligns with earlier comments about checking the articles in the journal and understanding sort of the language and the format and the things like that that particular journal is looking for. If you look for recent similar format articles in that journal, you should get a good sense of the kinds of information that the editorials team is going to be looking for when seeking to possibly publish your paper. Next slide. So on the flip side, sometimes it's good to think about what are common reasons for rejecting papers, so that we can then take a more proactive approach in helping to prevent or circumvent having that rejection. So as mentioned, I think the majority of papers that I end up desk rejecting as an editor are really due to poor fit. They don't align with our journal's mission. So our journal is health related in focus. So sometimes I get articles that are more medical related as opposed to pediatric psychology per se within a medical field. Or more often I get papers that are general kind of clinical psychology approach and have nothing to do with actually that practice within a pediatric healthcare system or by a pediatric psychologist. So that fit really is pertinent. and important when I first look at papers, and making sure that it fits with the roles and settings of the pediatric psychologists who are our readership. Also, I think another close second to that would be when the research really has an unclear or limited contribution to the field. So it doesn't feel like the particular research is filling a void, or taking the field in a new direction, or really providing information that's going to guide the training, practice, and professional issues within our field. Another reason could be just poor study design or approach. So not having hypotheses, using measures that don't have psychometric support, having methodological confounds that might be just fatal flaws in the study that severely limit the interpretation and application of the study findings. Or perhaps the lack of an appropriate comparison group, if that's something that's necessary for answering the study questions. We also see sometimes lack of rigor and or full reporting for qualitative studies. So there is a trend to use more qualitative research. I know I use a stakeholder approach more in my work as well, but it's very, very important to apply the same rigor to those studies as we do to our quantitative studies as well. Sometimes there may be serious analytic concerns. So maybe the analyses that are run are inappropriate, or perhaps there's a high probability of data bias. Maybe, for example, the attrition was so severe in a particular study that the resulting sample being analyzed has high risk for bias. Or we sometimes see, for example, too many analyses. I just recently read a paper that had a very small sample size and ran 10 large models of statistical analyses. And so it's kind of hard to interpret those findings and wonder whether it's just a flip of a coin or not, because the power and the statistical analyses were just too extensive for that power. And sometimes studies are just too exploratory approach, and so again are limited in what can be interpreted or applied from the study findings. And lastly, as was mentioned earlier, there can be some writing problems where there's grammatical issues or formatting issues that then make it difficult for the reviewers to really conclude about the science, because you're sort of distracted by a lot of the concerns with writing and formatting. So always important to look at the journal's approach to formatting articles. I know one of the things we're working with Sage right now for our journal is creating a checklist that we're going to be posting on the website that has a lot of the formatting issues there, so that authors can download that and cross-check their manuscript prior to submission. So hopefully that can help curtail some of these rejections early on and allow those papers to go through the peer review process. Next slide. So as was mentioned also earlier, remember the goal is to strengthen your manuscript. So when we're responding to reviewer feedback, I think it can be daunting, it can be frustrating. You submitted what you think is a great paper and you get the critical and constructive feedback that may be hard to address. Keeping in mind that the goal is to strengthen your paper, even if your paper is rejected, that feedback can be very, very helpful in revising your manuscript for a new venue, for a new journal, and important to do that as well. When you're responding to reviewer feedback, encourage you to address all points, not to make it where you pick and choose what you're going to address, but you actually address all points that the reviewers make. And you want to make it easy for the reviewers to see that you've addressed that feedback and to be able to evaluate the quality of your response to that. So 2 key ways to do that is to track your changes and edits in your manuscript so it's easy for the reviewer to locate those changes, but also to submit a response to review document where you list out each of the reviewer comments and then respond to those specifically as an author. So the reviewers can go back and look at that as well. It's important to be respectful and non-defensive. Sometimes you will get reviewer comments that you disagree with and you don't think you should be making those changes. And it's okay to respond to that and say that, but the tone and the respect needs to come forward. So, yes, that was a great suggestion, something that we would like to do in the future, but that's currently beyond the scope of this particular project and paper. Something along those lines lets the reviewer know that you are acknowledging their feedback in a respectful manner, but demonstrating that it's not something you can necessarily address. It's also really important to be timely in meeting the resubmission deadline. As we were talking, the review process, the publication process takes many, many months. And so if you can be timely in getting your resubmission in, that's just going to expedite getting your work out there and published. And if you ever have any questions, this is something that I think people don't often take advantage of, but email the editor and ask if you have questions or you need clarification. Sometimes editors may miss, for example, that reviewer one and reviewer three gave opposing advice and you don't know which one to go with. And so perhaps the editor missed that in their decision letter. And so just reach out and ask and say, hey, here's what's going on, or can you please clarify what the reviewer is asking for and what you would like to see? Those are good things. I mean, of course, be judicious, but the editors are available to help guide with that. Next slide. So I'd just like to welcome your contributions to our journal. We're definitely looking for clinical work. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to respond. Thank you for your time. I'll turn it back to Sean.
Thank you very much. Um, and as a reminder, we will be sending all the slides over, so you'll be able to get all this contact information. All right, I think we're ready now to move into the Q&A portion of today's webinar. So again, I see a handful of questions have come through, but if you've got anything else, please continue to send them. To get us kick-started, we have a good question here about AI. Is AI used in the process of checking compliance with guidelines, aims, and scopes, or is that all done manually?
I can start with that one, Sean. Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, AI is shaping so much of life on Earth, and although it's not ubiquitous and there's not vast unemployment, and it's not sort of running independently in any way. These are tools, and certainly in clinical medicine. I see the future of AI is one of decision support. I don't think robots are going to be doing surgery for me anytime soon, at least during my career. But to answer your question, I digress here a little bit. What we did in partnership with Sage, right when I took over as editor-in-chief, was implement, I guess, AI Lite. And all of the students who I've gone to universities, certainly in North America, are familiar with a platform called Authenticate. And what Authenticate does is basically screen for similarity of your submission when you do a report for a course that you're doing for coursework, and gives you a score. So very interestingly, we have been using that for the last 5 years. At the front end to look for duplicate publications and frankly, overt plagiarism. And I will tell you that probably once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, the score is too high and I have to desk reject an article because of it. And sometimes, the author will have questions about it, and I'll just be very transparent and send them the report that we get. A PDF gets generated from our end. And so just a little bit about desk rejection at the same time. I'm sure similar to Christina, we get lots of submissions and she's done a very nice job of describing why it's not a good fit. And, sometimes your research doesn't even make it to peer review for several reasons. One of them, from my perspective, is if if half your work has been plagiarized or duplicated from another work that you've done, that's not appropriate for our journal. So we wrote an editorial about that, and that's a policy of our journal to not obviously accept plagiarized or duplicated work. So that's how we're using AI. There is another manual way of us going through things, as Christina talked about. There's a checklist that she and her team are developing. We don't have one that's on our website, but there is a checklist that my managing editor will go through before I even see the article. So she'll go through a bunch of different things to make sure that the article sort of has all the boxes checked for at least my first screening before I decide whether or not it's ready for formal peer review. And I think, as I shared at the front end, 30%, ultimately 30% of articles that are submitted to our journal get published. So that means 70% are not. And I'm not quite sure of the breakdown of desk rejection versus other rejection, after the peer review process. But I would argue that it's probably a quarter of the articles are desk rejected, and then 3/4 of the ones that are ultimately rejected are ones that go through peer review. So a long-winded answer to tell you how we're using AI and how we're using AI Lite and how we're just going through old school ways of checking manually. But AI, I'm sure, will have more advantages and future scope for authors as well as editors.
Can I piggyback on that? Just two minor points too. One, I think we have to be cautious, and we recognize that as editors and using AI to check for things, because you're uploading manuscripts then to what could be potentially widespread use, because that's what when you enter things into AI, you've now shared that information. So we're cognizant of that, and that's probably why we're doing some of these old school checks on manuscripts that aren't yet published. So that's important to recognize. The second is, as many of my students have sadly found out the hard way, AI plagiarizes. So AI can produce false information, can also produce false references, but it also plagiarizes because it's getting information from publicly available information that's been either out there on the web or uploaded. And so that's another caution, I think, for authors in using AI, is recognizing that it can ping an authenticate report and get it, where at a score that it's not acceptable because of that.
Thank you both. It's very insightful and very useful. Yes, recognizing AI is continually growing and changing, and I'm sure we'll see continued development in the field. So it's nice to have an ear to the ground at this point. I have another question here. Actually, a few questions have come through about this that I'd like to kind of pull together. So we've had people asking, I'm new to conducting research. What tips do you have? And we've had some others, asking for specific goals to set as an early career researcher to develop your career and to become a name in your field. So I'm curious if you could share any thoughts on this, for somebody who may be developing their career as a researcher, as an academic, what tips do you have?
I'll take that one first, if that sounds good. It's really one key word, and that's called mentorship. I think mentorship is something that is so valuable at all stages of your career. So even though I've been doing my work for over 30 years, I still have mentors that are mentoring me about this stage of my career and what I'm doing. So I think mentorship is really key for young scientists in getting really that advice on how to set those goals, having some plans, and meeting with your mentor on a regular basis. So not just I have this mentor and I periodically ask them questions, but maybe scheduling meetings quarterly, for example, with a mentor where you set goals. So you may perhaps have like a year-long plan of your goals, and then you break those into quarterly goals, and you're accountable, and you can discuss those with your mentor as part of your routine meeting. So I think that is the best approach I feel for new folks getting started and wondering how to set goals for their research, how to write, how to do good science, because then those mentors are also there to give you feedback on what it is you're doing. So, for example, another uh, situation was recently I had a graduate student of mine who graduated many years ago sent me his R01 grant proposal and asked me to read it and edit it. And like it was really rewarding as a mentor to see how much he had grown in his career and what he was doing. But the fact that he reached out to me and asked me to do this many years after he's already graduated is just a sign of recognizing that the best science is science when you do get that kind of consultation and mentorship from folks in the field. So that would be my biggest suggestion.
I can also offer a few thoughts. I think that, I agree 100% with mentorship. I also have mentors that I turn to, and my fellowship, the person I did my fellowship with in Wisconsin 21 years ago, is still a mentor, and I turn to him. But the other point I think is really important with research in 2025 is teamwork. When I was starting research, it was me with a pile of charts and I was reviewing things. There was really, research ethics boards were in their infancy when I was a resident in plastic surgery, 25 years ago. Um, you know, uh, the amount of work that a PI does now is also an interesting point. We did a study, that similar study I referred to with how long it takes. Who does the work in their own contributions? Like what percentage of their contributions contribute to the final tally and task of getting your work published? And a PI's work in my study was like 10 to 15%. And so what that tells me is that, if I'm only doing 10 or 15% of the work, that means someone else is doing 85 to 90% of the work. And a lot of that work falls on research coordinators, as well as obviously the trainees that are involved in these projects. I mean, I think if you're a micromanager, you're going to have a tough time in research because it really is a good example of a collaborative exercise. And there, it's like a team building thing. I think that, seeing a project to the finish line is just really gratifying for me as a PI. So, developing your team would be the suggestion that I would give to really, starting your research career.
Thank you so much for that. Those are some great insights, and very useful. And I think definitely something we're seeing across all of our webinars. Lots of people are asking about mentorship and teamwork opportunities. So I think this is really great to hear. I have another question that came through about review papers. So someone asked, when writing a review paper, how can we make sure we are not just summarizing studies, but also adding critical analysis and new insights? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I can start with this. I think that at least in clinical plastic surgery, we're seeing this explosion of systematic reviews. And I think that, in some ways it's great, pooling data and doing meaningful analysis of studies that, maybe as I alluded to at the front end with my comments, sometimes historically there'd be 10 or 20 patients in a series. And so if you can pool that and get, 10 studies with 20 patients, now you're up to 200. I mean, you're improving the power. But the problem that I see, and we had a very insightful editorial on this in our journal within the last 6 months, is that it's really that old adage, garbage in, garbage out. I mean, if you cannot, if you're having, apples and oranges and pears and bananas in your study pool, well, it's going to be very difficult to extract meaningful data from those and then do a deep analysis. So I'm very cautious about systematic reviews. I understand their value and their ability to, draw some strong conclusions. But the real challenge is finding the correct stack of papers that really have answered the same question without too many confounders. Because once you introduce so many different confounding variables, it's very difficult to make conclusions. So I'm not sure if I've fully answered your question, but I think one thing is really asking a good question. And then, being very careful with what you include in in your Prisma checklist, for example, for a systematic review. 10 years ago, this was all the rage. And now, we're very cautious about making strong conclusions on like 3 studies. And we see that sometimes, you start with a 200 study entry on your Prisma checklist, you end up with 3 at the bottom. Well, and then you got an apple, an orange, and a pear, and so it's not as robust as you might think, even if you followed all the steps along your Prisma checklist. So be leery of the garbage in, garbage out, and if you want a very, I guess, opinionated viewpoint on that in a stronger tone, you can go to our journal and see one of the editorials again on this subject.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for one last question if we can. So somebody here has asked about a control randomized trial. For this, they're asking if a control randomized trial study design is the appropriate method to assign, sorry, in a control randomized trial, what study design is the appropriate method to assign out participants randomly? Do you have any insights into this?
I think it depends on the study question. First off, so for some studies, you may need to do some blocking of certain variables to control. So, for example, if I know, let's say I'm doing a study on an intervention to improve adherence, and I know disease severity is a variable that affects adherence. I want to make sure that my 2 groups are well balanced in terms of disease severity in order to not confound that particular variable in my study findings. So, randomization may need to take into consideration some of these potential variables that we need to control. But there are a variety of ways that and I'm not exactly sure if this is the part of the question, but there's a variety of ways to do randomization. REDCap, for example, has a built-in module to do randomization. We often see people using their biostatisticians to do the randomization sequence. So again, there's no potential for investigator bias there as well. So those would be some suggestions. There's really a variety of ways to do randomization.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Um, all right, I think actually with that, it is time, unfortunately, to wrap up today's webinar. I want to thank everybody for joining us and for your insights. For everybody joining us live, note that we will follow up in an email with the slides, a recording, and also a certificate of attendance. I'd like to thank my colleagues Joe and Alex and our guest speakers, Dr. Arnija and Dr. Duncan. Thank you very much for your insights. And for everybody joining us live, thank you for coming, and we hope to see you in a future webinar. In the meantime, take care. Thank you.